For over a decade, anyone who sat in the pews of the Grand Ole Opry witnessed a ghost. They saw a legend in his 70s, Jesse McReynolds, step up to the microphone alone. The space beside him, where his brother Jim had stood for 55 years, was now hauntingly empty. In 2002, Jim passed away, and the blood harmony they had shared, a sound so perfect it was like a single voice, was silenced forever. For 10 years, audiences watched the last brother singing alone, his high crystal tenor reaching for a harmony that would never come again. This was not the familiar violent tragedy of country music. The story of brother duos is a story of emotional wreckage. The Everly brothers imploded with hatred, and the Louvain brothers were torn apart by alcohol and violence. Their tragedies were about bonds that shattered. The tragedy of Jim and Jesse is the devastating opposite. Their 55-year partnership was a quiet marvel of love and stability, sealed only by a handshake. Their story is not about a bond that broke. It's about a perfect, unbreakable bond that was severed by mortality, leaving a void that could never be filled. The roots of this bond don't start in Nashville. They were forged in the red clay of Cartersville, Virginia. In a time before bluegrass even had a name, Jim and Jesse grew up in the quiet poverty of tobacco farming, a world away from the Kentucky coal mines. Their small, unpainted farmhouse had no electricity, but it was filled with music. This is the crucial detail. Music was not a choice. It was their inheritance. They were a musical dynasty. Their grandfather, Charles McReynolds, was a master fiddler who took his band to New York City to cut records for Victor. In 1915, Jim and Jesse grew up breathing this air, surrounded by their family's 70s and the sound of their father's fiddle and mother's organ. Into this world, a signal cut through the static on their battery-powered radio, the Grand Ole Opry. It was the golden age of brother duos. The boys sat on the floor, absorbing it all. The gentle sweetness of the Blue Sky Boys, the bluesy drive of the Delmores, and the raw, high-speed danger of the Monroe brothers. They soon got their own mail-order instruments. Jim, the steady anchor on guitar. Jesse, the quiet innovator, on mandolin. The moment they first sang together, the magic happened. Jim's warm baritone lead and Jesse's pure tenor fused into a third voice, a seamless sound that was uniquely theirs. After long days of farm chores, they practiced relentlessly, perfecting that smooth, flawless blend. Then, in the mid-1940s, a revolution came over the radio. Bill Monroe had hired Earl Scruggs, and the high, lonesome sound was supercharged with a machine gun banjo bluegrass was born. Jim and Jesse, now in their late teens, heard it and knew it was their future. They had the old-time music in their blood, the brother harmony in their throats, and now the new sound of bluegrass in their ears. They were perfectly positioned. They began playing locally at schoolhouse events and local gatherings. They were good. They were very good. In 1947, they landed their first professional gig at radio station WNVA in Norton, Virginia. They were still teenagers, but they were already professionals, playing live on the air. They were billed as Jim and Jesse and the Virginia Boys. They began to build a reputation. Their sound was different from the raw, edgy bluegrass coming out of Kentucky. It was smoother, more polished, more Virginia. Their harmonies were so perfectly in tune, so refined, that they already sounded like a seasoned act from Norton. They moved up to the big time of regional radio, the legendary WWVA Wheeling Jamboree in Wheeling, West Virginia. This was a major show, a rival to the Opry. They were now sharing bills with the biggest stars of the day. They were on their way. But in 1951, just as their career was gaining real momentum, the first great interruption came. The world intervened. A letter arrived at the family farm. Jim McReynolds, the older brother, the guitarist, the lead singer, the anchor of the entire act, was drafted into the United States Army to serve in the Korean War. The harmony was broken. This is a crucial and often overlooked period in their story. For the first time since they had learned to sing, the third voice was silenced. Jesse, not yet 22, was on his own. He could have quit. He could have gone home to the farm and waited. He didn't. He kept playing. He became a hired gun, a sideman, a role he was temperamentally unsuited for, but professionally capable of. He had to learn to play and sing with men who weren't Jim. He played mandolin for another duo, Hoke Jenkins and Curly Adkins. He was now the supporting player, not the main event. But most significantly, he did a brief but formative stint with one of the most foundational figures in the history of bluegrass, Carter Stanley. The Stanley brothers, Carter and Ralph, were themselves a legendary duo, but they had their own volatile relationship and had temporarily split up. Carter, the brilliant songwriter and guitarist, needed a mandolin player. He hired Jesse. Imagine this. Jesse, whose entire musical identity was wrapped up in his perfect smooth blend with Jim, was now on stage trying to harmonize with Carter Stanley, a man with one of the most famously emotional, lonesome, quiche, and idiosyncratic voices in all of music. It was an education. It was like a classical pianist being asked to sit in with a Delta bluesman. Jesse learned what it was to be a professional musician without his brother. He learned to adapt. He learned to survive. He was honing his craft, but he was a supporting player, a cog in someone else's machine. It was a foretaste, half a century early, of what it would be like to be a singular McReynolds on a stage, a tenor reaching for a harmony that wasn't his. Meanwhile, Jim was in Korea. He served on the front lines. He saw combat. He endured the brutal cold and the constant danger. Like so many men of his generation, he rarely, if ever, spoke about what he saw there. But war changes a man. When he was finally discharged in 1952, a decorated veteran, he returned to Virginia with a new, hardened sense of purpose. The reunion was immediate. The two brothers, now men, one a seasoned professional sideman, the other a combat veteran, stepped back onto a stage together. The moment they sang, the third voice was back. But it was different. It was stronger, deeper, richer with life experience. This was no longer a childhood hobby. This was their life. They reformed the Virginia Boys. They had a new determination, a new professionalism they had lost time to make up for. They packed their bags and made a decision that would forge them into the ultimate professionals. They left Virginia and headed for the new wild frontier of American entertainment, live television. They drove south to Orlando, Florida, where they had landed a spot on a weekly live broadcast called the Old Florida Barn Dance. This is where Jim and Jesse were truly born. In the high-pressure, no-second-take world of live television in the 1950s, they were forged. They had to be perfect every single time. They learned how to time a song to the second, how to move on camera, how to interact with an audience, how to smile when a light blew or a string broke. Jim blossomed as the quintessential frontman. He was the warm, folksy, reassuring presence. He was the one who would talk to the audience, tell a gentle joke, and make everyone feel at home. He was the anchor. Jesse, by contrast, remained the quiet, smiling virtuoso beside him. He let his playing do the talking. But while Jim was perfecting his role as the host, Jesse was in the woodshed, quietly starting a revolution. He was still in awe of Earl Scruggs. Every musician was. The banjo roll was the sound that defined bluegrass. But Jesse was also listening to other players like the innovative guitarist Chet Atkins, who was developing his own complex multi-finger picking style. Jesse looked at his mandolin, an instrument traditionally played with a rigid percussive down-up strum or a fast tremolo-style picking, and he was still obsessed with the sound of the Scruggs banjo roll. Why, he thought, can't the mandolin do that? The problem was mechanical. The banjo roll was played with a thumb and two fingers, allowing for a continuous syncopated ripple of notes. The mandolin was played with a single, flat pick. It seemed physically impossible to replicate that sound. So Jesse invented a way. He sat for hundreds, maybe thousands of hours, his right hand a blur. He developed a new technique, a blindingly fast, complex picking pattern that involved striking 3 different strings in a continuous rolling motion. It was not the chop of Monroe. It was a liquid, flowing, circular cascade of notes. He had, in effect, taught himself to play a banjo roll with a single pick. It was, and is, one of the most difficult techniques in all of string band music. He called it simply Jesse's style. The world would come to call it cross-picking. It was a sound no one had ever heard from a mandolin before. It could be driving and rhythmic like a bubbling spring, or it could be gentle and ethereal like a harp. He had single-handedly unlocked a new voice for the instrument, a voice that was uniquely his now. All the pieces were in place. They had the blood harmony perfected since childhood. They had the gentleman professionalism forged in the fires of live television. And they had the secret weapon, Jesse's revolutionary cross-picking. With this unique sound, they were ready to conquer the music world. They signed their first major record deal with Capitol Records in 1952, the same label as country superstars like Tex Ritter and Ferlin Husky. They began to record what are now considered timeless bluegrass classics, Are You Missing Me? I'll Be There, Mary Dear, and the haunting Grave in the Valley. But the timing once again was terrible. It was the mid-1950s. A young man from Tupelo, Mississippi, had just walked into Sun Studios in Memphis. His name was Elvis Presley. Rock and roll was about to explode, and the entire acoustic world of Jim and Jesse was about to be drowned out. They were masters of a craft that the mainstream market was suddenly and violently ignoring. They had achieved perfection at the exact moment the world had stopped listening. They reached their artistic peak at the very moment the world turned its attention elsewhere. The year was 1955. Jim and Jesse had returned from the Korean War, forged themselves into the ultimate professionals in the crucible of live television, and Jesse had just invented a revolutionary new language for his instrument. They had a pristine, sophisticated, and intricate sound. And then Elvis Presley released Heartbreak Hotel. It was not just a song, it was a societal explosion. Almost overnight, the entire musical landscape was redrawn. The measured, polite world of brother duos and string band music was not just old-fashioned, it was practically prehistoric. The new sound was raw, sexual, and amplified. It was the sound of teenage rebellion, of screaming crowds, of drums and electric guitars played so loud they distorted. This was the great dark age of bluegrass. While rock and roll was conquering the globe, country music itself was running scared. In an attempt to compete, producers in Nashville, led by men like Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley, created the Nashville sound. They took the hillbilly element, the fiddles and steel guitars, and drowned it in lush string sections, smooth background vocalists, and the slip note piano of Floyd Kramer. They created a new sophisticated country pop, sung by stars like Patsy Cline, Eddie Arnold, and Jim Reeves. This left bluegrass, and by extension Jim and Jesse, in an impossible position. They were trapped in a commercial pincer movement. On one side, the mainstream country radio market, now dominated by the Nashville sound, considered them hopelessly rustic. Their all-acoustic, harmony-based music was seen as hillbilly music, the very thing the producers were trying to erase to gain uptown respectability. On the other side, the remaining hardcore bluegrass purists, the small but fervent audience that still bought Bill Monroe records, were wary of them. Their sound wasn't the raw, bluesy, high lonesome wail of Monroe or the Stanley Brothers. It was smooth. It was polished. Jesse's cross-picking sounded almost classical in its complexity. Their harmonies were so perfectly in tune, they lacked the grit that purists often mistook for authenticity. They were too country for the bluegrass crowd, and too bluegrass for the country crowd. They were in a commercial no man's land. They were bouncing between record labels. They had recorded for Capitol, moved to Columbia, and would soon move to Epic. They were cutting what are now considered timeless classic recordings. But at the time, nothing was sticking. The world was too loud to hear their intricate, quiet genius. They were, in a word, grinding. They were working the barn dance circuit in Florida and throughout the South. This was not the Grand Ole Opry. This was the B circuit, playing in high school auditoriums, local TV stations, and regional fairs. They were professionals, but they were not stars. They were making a living, but just barely. This is the period that defines their character. Many of their peers, faced with this same existential crisis, made a choice. The Osborne brothers, for example, were having this exact same struggle. They were starving. And their solution, as we know, was a conscious, brilliant act of commercial blasphemy. Add drums, add electric bass, and aim for the radio. Jim and Jesse faced the same choice. They could have plugged in. They could have hired a drummer. They could have slicked up their sound, tried to fit into the Nashville sound. They made a different wager. They would not change their sound. They would not compromise the third voice or the acoustic purity of their music. They would not add drums. Instead of changing their product, they would outwork, outperform, and outlast everyone. They wagered on their own quiet, relentless professionalism. They wagered on themselves. They just needed a lifeline. And in the late 1950s, it came from two completely unexpected opposite directions. The first lifeline came from the North. It came from college campuses. Just as rock and roll was reaching its zenith of greasy, rebellious energy, a counter-movement was born, the folk revival. A new generation of college-educated middle-class kids, led by groups like the Kingston Trio, began to look for something authentic. They were suspicious of commercial pop and wanted music with roots. This movement, which would soon launch the careers of Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and Peter, Paul, and Mary, created a massive new market for acoustic music. Suddenly, record labels and festival promoters were climbing into the mountains and digging through the archives looking for real folk musicians. And they found bluegrass. The genre was instantly rebranded. It was no longer hillbilly music. It was American folk music. Bill Monroe, the Stanley Brothers, and Flatt and Scruggs were invited to play at places they had never dreamed of: college auditoriums, coffee houses in Greenwich Village, and, most prestigious of all, the Newport Folk Festival. Jim and Jesse were perfectly positioned for this new audience. Unlike the more raw or scary mountain performers, they were the gentlemen of bluegrass. They were polished, professional, and accessible. Jim's warm, articulate stage presence and Jesse's mind-boggling technical virtuosity were a perfect fit for a curious, educated audience. They were less a novelty and more an art form. Throughout the early 1960s, they became staples on the folk festival circuit, playing to enraptured audiences of Northern college students who would sit in respectful, cross-legged silence, trying to comprehend what Jesse was doing with his hands. This new folk audience gave them a vital new revenue stream critical acclaim, and a sense of artistic validation during a time when Nashville had turned its back on them. But while the folk revival was good for their art, their hearts were still in the South. Their goal, the only goal that had ever mattered, was still the one they'd dreamed of as boys, the Grand Ole Opry. This brings us to the second and more crucial lifeline. It was not a record deal. It was a bag of flour. In the world of classic country music, there was one holy grail of sponsorship: Martha White flour. Since 1948, the Martha White brand had been inextricably linked with bluegrass, thanks to their sponsorship of Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs. The Martha White theme song was arguably the most famous jingle in the South. This sponsorship didn't just pay the bills, it gave Flatt and Scruggs their own syndicated radio and later television shows. It was this daily presence that made them the most beloved and recognized bluegrass act in the world. Jim and Jesse, with their clean-cut image and unwavering professionalism, were the ideal candidates to become the next Martha White act. They were the opposite of a liability. They were, as the executives could see, a safe bet. In the early 1960s, they secured the coveted sponsorship. It cannot be overstated how massive this was. It was for their career more important than any record deal. Martha White gave Jim and Jesse their own syndicated television show. Suddenly, the Jim and Jesse show was being beamed into living rooms all over the South, 5 days a week, often in the afternoon or early evening slot, right before the 6 o'clock news. This daily, consistent presence was transformative. They were no longer a band you had to drive 100 miles to see at a fair. They were in your home. Jim's warm, easygoing manner made him feel like a trusted friend. Jesse's quiet virtuosity became a daily marvel. They played their songs, they sang their perfect harmonies, and they held up a bag of hot, rising flour. They were now household names to the core country audience, far bypassing the radio stations that had ignored them. They had built their own platform, and this brings us to the secret of their endurance. This is the personal story that defines their entire career. The reason Martha White trusted them, the reason they endured the dark ages, the reason they never imploded was their bond. It was the handshake. For 55 years as a professional duo, Jim and Jesse McReynolds never had a written contract between them. Let that sink in. In a business that is notorious for lawsuits, for betrayals, for arguments over publishing rights and royalties, their entire complex, decades-long business was run on a single, verbal 50-50 agreement. This one fact is the key to understanding their entire story. The music industry is built on ego and rivalry. Brother duos are even worse, freighted with a lifetime of childhood jealousies. The Louvin, the Everlys, the Monroes, they all imploded over who wrote what, who sang what, and, most of all, who got paid what. Jim and Jesse were immune to it. Their partnership wasn't just balanced, it was perfectly complementary. Jim, the older brother, was the front man and the anchor. He was the one with the easy charm, the one who talked to the audience and the business executives. He handled the bookings. He handled the money. He was the sturdy, reliable leader who kept the ship sailing. Jesse, the younger brother, was the inside man and the engine. He was quiet, shy, and introverted. He was the musical architect, the restless innovator. His domain was the music itself. While Jim was at the front of the bus, driving or navigating, Jesse would be in the back, quietly, endlessly tinkering. He would be listening to new music, country, rock, jazz, and thinking about how to adapt it. He would be refining his cross-picking, or even inventing new instruments like the mandolin, a hybrid instrument. He built himself. Jim trusted Jesse with the music. Jesse trusted Jim with the business. 100%. It was a perfect symbiosis. There was no ego, no competition. Musicians who played with them as Virginia boys over the years, and they had some of the best, like legendary banjo player Alan Shelton, all tell the same story. The bus was clean. There was no drinking. There were no drugs. There was no drama. Jim and Jesse never argued. They never raised their voices. They would arrive at a gig on time. They would wear their matching, tasteful suits. They would walk on stage and perform a flawless 2-hour show. They would come off stage, sign autographs for every single person in line, get back on the bus, and drive to the next town. This was their life. It was a life of relentless, quiet, professional discipline. This is why Martha White trusted them. This is why the folk festivals loved them. This is why, in 1964, after more than 15 years of professional grinding, after surviving the rock and roll apocalypse and the indifference of Nashville radio, they finally got the call. It was the call from the Grand Ole Opry. On March 2nd, 1964, Jim and Jesse were invited to become official, lifetime members of the Opry. This was not just another gig. This was the coronation. This was the sanctuary. This was the single ultimate validation for the two boys from Cartersville, Virginia, who had spent their childhoods huddled around a battery-powered radio, dreaming of this very moment. They were now the gentlemen of the Opry. It was an identity that fit them like a glove. They had a permanent home. They had a weekly stage. They had secured their place in the royal family of country music. And with this new elevated status, the record labels began to see them in a new light. They were now on Epic Records, and their producer was Billy Sherrill. This was an odd pairing. Sherrill was the architect of the lush, string-drenched countrypolitan sound, the man who would create Stand By Your Man for Tammy Wynette. He was a pop producer, not a bluegrass purist, but he was a genius, and he respected their sound. He let them be them. And in 1967, this odd combination produced magic. It was the summer of love. The world was full of psychedelic rock. It was the exact same year that their old friends, the Osborne brothers, were in the studio with their pop producer, committing their blasphemy by adding drums and electric bass to create Rocky Top. Jim and Jesse were in the studio. They had recorded an entire album, but they needed one more song. A young, unknown songwriter named Jimmy Griggs pitched them a novelty tune he'd written. It was a fast, witty, narrative-driven song about a truck driver running hot, trying to avoid a way station. With a smoky on his tail, it was called Diesel on My Tail. It was not a high, lonesome ballad about loss. It was not a gospel song about salvation. It was a 3-minute action movie. They recorded it. Billy Sherrill, to his eternal credit, did not add strings or a piano. He let them record it as pure 100% acoustic bluegrass. Jesse kicked it off with a blistering cross-picking solo that sounded like a revving engine. Jim sang the breathless lead vocal with a wry, storytelling charm, and their blood harmony locked in on the chorus as tight as a drum. The song was released, and it was a monster. It shot up the Billboard country charts, peaking at number 12. It was all over the radio. In a world of hippies and psychedelic guitars, Jim and Jesse had scored a massive crossover hit with one of the purest bluegrass songs ever recorded. It became an anthem, a standard, and the flagship of the entire truck-driving music subgenre. Now, compare the irony. The Osborne brothers' Rocky Top, full of drums and electric bass, became a massive hit, but it made them pariahs to the bluegrass traditionalists for selling out. Jim and Jesse's Diesel on My Tail, which was 100% acoustic and traditional in its instrumentation, was such an undeniable, brilliant, and popular hit that the purists had no choice but to embrace it. It was so good, it didn't matter that it was a novelty song. Jim and Jesse had done the impossible. They had achieved a massive mainstream commercial hit without compromising their sound. Their long, patient wager on their own professionalism had paid off. They were now officially superstars. They were the gentlemen of the Opry, the faces of Martha White, and the hit makers behind Diesel on My Tail. Their career, their legacy was set in stone, but as the 1960s came to a close, they were not content to rest. They had proven their commercial power. They had proven their traditional bona fides. Now they were about to prove just how far their elegant acoustic sound could stretch by tackling the most un-bluegrass songbook imaginable. They had achieved perfection at the exact moment the world had stopped listening. And then, through a combination of relentless, disciplined work, a flawless public image, and a massive, unexpected novelty hit, they had forced the world to listen again. By 1968, Jim and Jesse were no longer just surviving. They were reigning. Diesel, On My Tail, had done something miraculous. It had given them a massive mainstream country hit without forcing them to compromise their acoustic sound. This single act had secured their position. They were now the undisputed gentlemen of the Grand Ole Opry, the beloved faces of Martha White, and bona fide country stars who had crossed over on their own terms. This new stability, financial, professional, and artistic, did not make them complacent. It did the opposite. It gave them freedom. For Jesse McReynolds in particular, this was a golden era. He was a man with a restless, analytical, and deeply curious musical mind. He was an engineer who just happened to play the mandolin, while Jim, the steady older brother, was happily solidifying their status as crowd-pleasing entertainers. Jesse was in the back of the tour bus, his mind already somewhere else. He was listening. He was listening to the Beatles. He was listening to Merle Haggard. And most curiously, he was listening to the founding father of rock and roll guitar, Chuck Berry. To the outside world, this was absurd. What could a middle-aged, suit-wearing, acoustic mandolin player from Virginia possibly have in common with the duck-walking, electric guitar-shredding poet laureate of Teenage Rebellion? To the purists in bluegrass, this was not just absurd, it was heretical. It was one thing for the Osborne brothers to chase commercial radio, but this was toying with the very DNA of the enemy. But Jesse didn't hear an enemy. He didn't hear genres. He heard music, and in the raw, blues-drenched, narrative-driven songs of Chuck Berry, he heard the same storytelling roots that he had grown up with. He heard melodies and chord structures that were, at their core, just fast-paced 12-bar blues, the same blues that Bill Monroe had injected into his own music 3 decades earlier. And in Chuck Berry's iconic double-stop guitar licks, Jesse heard a technical challenge. He looked at his mandolin, with its revolutionary cross-picking style, and he asked himself a question that no one else in the world was asking. Can I do that? He began to tinker. He would sit for hours, a Chuck Berry record playing on a small turntable, his fingers a blur on his mandolin. He wasn't just copying the licks, he was translating them. He was figuring out how to use his flat pick and his cross-picking rolls to replicate the sound of Berry's electric guitar. It was an act of masterful bilingual musicianship. He figured it out. He could play Johnny B. Goode, he could play Maybelline, he could play Memphis, Tennessee, and it didn't sound like a joke, it sounded incredible. He brought the idea to Jim. Jim, the practical one, the one with his finger on the pulse of their audience, could have easily vetoed it as too strange, too risky, but he had absolute 50-50 faith in his brother's musical genius. If Jesse said it would work, it would work. They took the idea to their producer, Billy Sherrill, again. Sherrill could have laughed them out of the studio. Instead, he recognized the brilliance and perhaps the sheer wonderful oddity of it. He greenlit the project. In 1970, Jim and Jesse released the album Berry Pickin' in the Country. The album is a masterpiece of translation. It is the single greatest testament to their unique philosophy. On Maybelline, Jesse's mandolin perfectly replicates the introductory electric guitar solo, a cascade of cross-picked notes that has all the fire of the original on Memphis, Tennessee. Jim's smooth, warm vocal delivery turns Barry's rapid-fire, teenage angst into a heartfelt country story song. The banjo, played by their longtime sideman Alan Shelton, finds a way to swing the rock and roll rhythm, driving the beat without a single drum. The album cover itself was a statement. It featured a cartoon drawing of a long-haired guitar-playing Chuck Berry with Jim and Jesse in their neat suits, literally picking berries off his guitar. The reaction from the music world was, fascinatingly, not the scandal one might expect. And this is where the Gentleman's Wager proved its genius. When the Osborne brothers released Rocky Top, they were crucified by the purists. Why? Because they had broken the sacred commandments of instrumentation. They had added drums and electric bass. It was seen as a betrayal of the sound, a desperate sellout to commercial radio. Jim and Jesse's Chuck Berry album, while arguably more musically radical, was recorded 100% acoustically. There were no drums. There was no electric bass. It was just fiddle, banjo, mandolin, guitar, and acoustic bass. They had used the purest bluegrass instrumentation to play the most impure rock and roll. The purists were confounded. They didn't know what to do with it. It was too hillbilly for the rock stations, but it was too rock and roll for the hardcore bluegrass festivals. And yet, it was so technically brilliant, so undeniably well played, that it couldn't be dismissed. This album, more than any other, crystallized the great quiet controversy that would define their legacy. It was not a debate about selling out. It was a debate about soul. Were Jim and Jesse too good, too polished, too clever? In their quest for perfection, had they made bluegrass so smooth that they had sanded off its very essence? This began the trial of the gentleman, a philosophical argument that raged quietly in the pages of Bluegrass Unlimited magazine, in the parking lots of festivals, and in the back rooms of record stores for decades. The prosecution, the hardcore traditionalists, the purists who worshipped at the altar of the high lonesome sound, made a powerful case. It went something like this. Bluegrass is more than a set of instruments, they would argue. It is a feeling. It is the sound of hardship. It is the sound of the Appalachian Mountains, of the coal mine, of loss, of a desperate, keening cry for salvation. It is supposed to be raw. It is Bill Monroe's bluesy, percussive bark. It is Ralph Stanley's ancient, terrifying, modal wail. When you hear the Stanley brothers sing "Oh Death," you are hearing the primal fear of existence. And what, they would ask, do you get from Jim and Jesse? You get perfection. You get polish. You get two men in immaculate matching suits, singing harmonies so perfectly in tune that all the grit is gone. It's the sound of the suburban living room, not the mountain cabin. It's easy listening bluegrass. Diesel on My Tail is a catchy, clever novelty song, not a profound statement of the human condition. And this Chuck Berry album, it's a gimmick. It's cocktail bluegrass. It's technically impressive, but it has no soul. They have taken the language of God and used it to tell clever jokes. It was a potent argument, and for many, it was the truth. They respected Jim and Jesse, but they didn't feel them in their bones. But then, The defense, a side comprised mostly of other musicians, critics, and a new generation of players, stood up, and their case was, in its own way, just as strong. "You are not listening," the defense would say. "You are confusing shouting with emotion. You are confusing raw with authentic." First, they would argue, let's talk about the music itself. You call Jesse's cross-picking a gimmick? That gimmick is a revolutionary four-fingered language for a two-fingered instrument. It is as technically and artistically important as Earl Scruggs's three-finger roll. It requires a level of discipline, precision, and musical intelligence that is staggering a new generation of players. Men like David Grisman, Tony Rice, and Chris Thile are building entire careers on the foundation that Jesse laid. To dismiss that as soulless is to admit you don't understand it. Second, let's talk about the harmony. You call it too smooth? That smoothness is not a lack of passion. It is the ultimate expression of control and empathy. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to sing that perfectly in tune with that level of microtonal precision with another human being for 50 years? It's an athletic and artistic achievement that is almost superhuman. That smoothness is the sound of a perfect 50-year bond. It is the sound of two souls in complete alignment. How is that not soul? And finally, let's talk about the gimmicks. That Chuck Berry album wasn't a joke. It was a thesis. It was a profound musical argument. It proved that bluegrass was not a fragile, dead language, a museum piece to be preserved in amber. It proved that bluegrass was a living, robust, flexible language, strong enough to translate any great American music, from rock and roll to pop ballads. They were not diluting the genre. They were proving its strength. They weren't heretics. They were the greatest missionaries the music ever had. This was the debate, and while it raged, Jim and Jesse did what they always did. They ignored it. They just kept working. They were now global ambassadors for the music. While the outlaw movement of Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson was raging in Austin, and other bluegrass acts were struggling to find a footing, Jim and Jesse were touring the world. They became, improbably, superstars in Japan. This became a regular and cherished part of their career. They would fly to Tokyo and play to sold-out concert halls. The contrast was beautiful. Here were these two courtly, soft-spoken gentlemen from Virginia, standing in front of an audience of hundreds of Japanese fans who would sit in absolute reverent silence. They wouldn't clap or hoot. They would watch. They were specifically watching Jesse's hands. In Japan, where technical mastery is revered as the highest art form, Jesse McReynolds was not an entertainer. He was a sensei. They were disciples. Young Japanese musicians would sit in the front rows, binoculars and notepads in hand, literally trying to deconstruct his cross-picking technique, a style so complex it defied notation. Jim and Jesse, in turn, treated these audiences with a profound, gentle respect. Back home, they were the rock of the Grand Ole Opry. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the long golden afternoon of their career, they were the standard bearers. While other stars came and went, fought with management, or descended into personal chaos, Jim and Jesse were the constant. They never missed a show when they were in town. They were the first to arrive, the last to sign autographs. They were the model of professionalism that the Opry was built on. They recorded dozens of albums. They recorded beautiful, straightforward country albums. They recorded moving gospel albums, returning to the hymns of their youth. They recorded tribute albums to their heroes, like the Delmore brothers. They were no longer striving for a hit. They were reigning as living legends. They were, quite simply, the most respected and universally beloved act in the entire business. Finally, in 1993, the verdict in their long, quiet trial was delivered. The International Bluegrass Music Association, the genre's official governing body, voted to induct Jim and Jesse into the Bluegrass Hall of Fame. This was the ultimate vindication. This was the church itself, the organization full of the very purists who had debated their authenticity, officially and eternally recognizing their contribution. It was a declaration that their smooth sound was not bluegrass light, but a foundational pillar of the music. It was an acknowledgement that Jesse's cross-picking was not a gimmick, but a revolutionary invention. The gentlemen had won their wager. They had reached the absolute pinnacle of their profession. They were revered as icons, loved as men, and immortalized in the Hall of Fame. They were in their 60s, healthy, happy, and still singing in perfect, sublime harmony. They had built a perfect, unshakable life. And as the 1990s drew to a close, none of them could have known that this very perfection was about to make the end when it came so unimaginably, profoundly tragic. The first faint shadow was beginning to fall. By the mid-1990s, the lives of Jim and Jesse McReynolds had settled into a golden equilibrium. Their 1993 induction into the Bluegrass Hall of Fame was not a capstone, but a permanent validation, elevating them from mere performers to elder statesmen. They were living icons, and they wore the mantle with their familiar, easy grace. Picture a typical Saturday night at the Grand Ole Opry, circa 1997. The backstage area at the Ryman Auditorium, the hallowed, aging mother church of country music, was a kind of organized chaos. Legends were everywhere. Porter Wagoner, glittering in a rhinestone nudie suit, would be holding court. Little Jimmy Dickens, diminutive but larger than life, would be preparing for his spot. Newer stars, perhaps a young Alison Krauss or even a visiting Garth Brooks, might be moving through, their eyes still wide with the simple awe of being in the room. And in that chaos, there would be two constants. Jim and Jesse McReynolds would arrive, not late, not early. They would be in their matching suits, perfectly pressed, perhaps a deep navy or a chestnut brown, understated but impeccable. They would not be in the loud, backslapping clusters. They would be standing slightly to the side, radiating an aura of calm professionalism. Jim, the older brother, the front man, would be the one facing outward. He would be smiling, a warm, genuine smile. He would shake hands with fans and fellow musicians. His voice was gentle with that soft Virginia lilt. He was the gentleman of the Opry. Jesse, the younger brother, the musical master, would be beside him, quieter, more internal. He would be holding his prized F5 mandolin, perhaps running a light thumb over the strings, checking its tune, his mind already on stage, on the music. His smile was rarer, but just as real. When their name was called, "And now," the announcer would boom, "Please welcome the beloved members of the Opry, the gentlemen of bluegrass, Jim and Jesse." They would step into the light. There would be no surprises, no dangerous improvisation. They would step to the microphone. Jim would say something warm. And then they would begin. They might play "Diesel on My Tail." The crowd would clap along, energized. Jesse would take his blistering cross-picking solo with a mind-boggling, fluid precision. They might play an old ballad like "Are You Missing Me?" Jim's voice would take the lead, sturdy as an oak, and Jesse's tenor would rise up, locking into it, creating that third voice, the perfect seamless sound that had defined their lives. It was beautiful, it was professional, and it was reliable. Jim and Jesse were not just a band. They were a fact of nature. They were a constant. In the country music universe, The sun rose in the east, the tides came in, and Jim and Jesse sang harmony on Saturday night. This consistency, this 50-year stability was their legacy. And it was this stability that made the shadow, when it fell, so profoundly dark. In the late 1990s, Jim began to feel unwell. It wasn't a sudden dramatic event, just a persistent fatigue, a rasp in his throat that wouldn't seem to clear. He was Jim. He was the anchor. He was the reliable older brother. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke. He lived a clean, disciplined life. He was used to powering through. He had powered through the Korean War. He could certainly power through a lingering cold, but it didn't go away. It got worse. Singing, which had always been as easy as breathing, began to be an effort. Doctors were consulted, tests were run, and then he was called back. It was not a public announcement. There was no press release, no headline in the Tennessean. It was a conversation in a sterile doctor's office under a fluorescent light. It was cancer, specifically thyroid cancer. Pause for a moment on that cruel irony: cancer of the thyroid, a disease that attacks the very throat, the very mechanism of the voice, the very tool of his trade. For a singer, it was a uniquely vicious sentence. Jim, now in his 70s, the man who had built an empire on stability, was now facing the ultimate chaos, the betrayal of his own body. The first conversation must have been with Jesse. We will never know the words. They were kept private, with the same dignity that defined their lives. But imagine that moment. The two men, the two brothers, the two halves of a whole, sitting in a living room, perhaps at Jim's house, as Jim had to tell Jesse that the anchor was coming loose. For Jesse, this was not just news of an illness. It was a seismic event that shook the foundation of his reality. His entire professional life since he was a teenager had been built on one fundamental assumption. Jim would be there, to his left, playing the guitar, singing the lead. Now, for the first time, the possibility that he wouldn't be was real. This industry is full of stories of acts breaking up for far less. But Jim and Jesse were not built that way. Their 50-50 handshake deal was deeper than business. It was a covenant, and so they made a decision. They would fight, and they would keep working. For men of their generation, men forged by the Depression and war, work was not just a career, it was an identity. To stop working was to surrender, and Jim McReynolds was not a man who surrendered. The silent fight began. This is the most quietly heroic and most tragic period of their 55-year career. For several years, from roughly 1999 to 2002, Jim fought his cancer with a quiet, steely grit. He would undergo brutal, exhausting radiation treatments during the week. These treatments ravaged his body, seared his throat. He would be left so weak he could barely stand. And then on Saturday night, he would get up, he would put on his suit, he would comb his hair, and he would drive to the Grand Ole Opry. The audience sitting out in the pews was largely unaware they were there to hear Diesel on My Tail. They were there for the sweet harmonies. They might have noticed that Jim looked a little thinner, a little tired, but he was a man in his 70s. He was still there, but the people backstage, the fellow musicians, they knew. They saw Jim arrive, walking a little slower, leaning on a wall. They saw Jesse at his side, not with a fuss, but with a quiet, supporting presence. Jesse would carry Jim's guitar. They would stand in the wings just as they had thousands of nights before, and then their names would be called. Imagine that walk. Jim, for whom every swallow was an act of agony from the radiation burns, stepping into that circle of light. The applause would wash over him. The spotlight would hit him, and Jesse would take his place. To his right, they would begin. Jim would sing his voice. Once that warm, solid baritone was thinner now. It had a fragility, a tremor that had never been there before. But he sang. He pushed what strength he had left into that microphone, singing the songs he had sung his entire life, and Jesse would sing. This is where the tragedy deepens. Jesse's tenor, crystal and strong, was still there. He would sing his harmony part. But that harmony was now more than a musical embellishment. It was a physical support. He would sing and his voice would wrap around Jim's, filling in the cracks, covering the wavers, literally holding up the melody where Jim's strength was failing. The third voice they created now had a new meaning. It was no longer just the sound of perfection. It was the sound of loyalty. It was the sound of one brother using his own voice to carry the other. Imagine the cognitive dissonance of standing on that stage. They are singing Diesel on My Tail, an upbeat, fun song about running from the police, all while knowing the lead singer is actively, privately dying. They are singing Are You Missing Me?, a lonesome love ballad, and the words take on a new terrible weight. Are you missing me? Jesse, the introverted musician, the man who spent his life analyzing music, was now engaged in the most complex emotional performance of his life. He had to play his technically perfect cross-picking solo and exercise in pure left brain concentration while his heart was breaking. He had to stand there smiling to the crowd while watching his 50-year partner, his brother, his other half, fade away in real time right next to him. This was the final unwritten clause of their 50-50 handshake. In sickness and in health, till death do us part. They were, quite literally, fulfilling it. In public, Jim fought. He fought through 2000, 2001. He fought into 2002. But by the fall of 2002, the fight was almost over. The cancer had spread. The treatments had taken their toll. He was 75 years old and he was exhausted. The guitar became too heavy to hold. The walk to the stage became too long. The voice, finally, was almost gone. In November 2002, he played his last show at the Grand Ole Opry. There was no announcement, no farewell performance. It was just another Saturday night. But the people backstage knew. Jesse knew. Jim walked out on stage one last time. Perhaps he didn't even hold his guitar. Perhaps he just stood, frail, next to his brother. They sang. Maybe it was a gospel hymn, something gentle. Jim's voice was barely a whisper. Jesse's voice wrapped around it, carried it to the crowd. They finished the song. The applause came, just as it always had. Jim nodded, maybe managed a smile, and then he and Jesse turned and walked back into the darkness of the wings. For the first time in 55 years, the act, Jim and Jesse, was over. Jim was taken home to be cared for by his longtime companion, Arletta. The final weeks were quiet. Jesse was there. The family was there. They sat with him as the man who had been the anchor, the rock, the warm older brother, slowly drifted away. On New Year's Eve, December the 31st, 2002, Jim McReynolds passed away. He was 75. The country music world mourned. The obituaries praised him as a gentleman, a legend, a pillar of the Opry. But for one man, it was not the passing of a legend. For Jesse McReynolds, 73 years old, it was the end of his world. The 55-year handshake was over. The 55-year harmony was broken. The third voice was gone from the earth. Jesse had not just lost his brother. He had not just lost his best friend and his business partner. He had lost half of his voice. Imagine it. Imagine waking up one morning and a part of your body, a part of your soul, a sound you have heard next to you every single day for 6 decades, is permanently gone. The silence Jim left behind was not just the absence of a voice. It was a void, a gaping, echoing emptiness. Jesse McReynolds, for the first time in his adult life, was completely and truly alone. The question now was, what does one half of a perfect whole do? What does a harmony singer do when there is no lead left to harmonize with? One half of Jim and Jesse was gone, and Jesse, the survivor, the younger brother, the musical master, now had to face a final lonely decade trying to figure out how to sing alone. The silence in the days after December 31st, 2002 must have been absolute. For Jesse McReynolds, 73 years old, the world had fundamentally tilted on its axis. It wasn't just grief for a lost brother. It was a profound professional and even physical disorientation. For 55 years, nearly every major decision, every musical arrangement, every road trip, and every performance had been a shared experience. Now there was no one to turn to in that familiar way. The 50-50 handshake deal, the only business contract he had ever known, was dissolved by mortality. The anchor was gone. The entire country music industry expected Jesse to retire. It seemed the only logical, dignified thing to do. He was 73. He had a lifetime of accolades. He had Hall of Fame status. His health was good, but he had earned his rest. The act, as the world knew it, was over. To try and continue it alone seemed not just impossible, but perhaps even a little sad. But they misunderstood the man. And they misunderstood the nature of the bond. Jesse McReynolds was not just a harmony singer. He was, and always had been, the musical engine of the duo. And Jim was not just his lead singer. He was his brother, his partner. The act was not just a job. It was their shared identity. To retire would be to let Jim and Jesse die. It would be to silence the music completely. And then there was the practical matter, the Grand Ole Opry. Their membership, that sacred spot they had earned in 1964, was theirs. It was a lifetime appointment. To give it up would be to surrender the castle they had spent their lives building. So Jesse, the quiet, introverted gentleman, made a decision. It was a decision of profound, almost stubborn loyalty. He would not retire. He would continue to perform. He would keep the Virginia Boys, their longtime band, together. He would fulfill their Opry obligations. And, in the most moving gesture of all, he would not change the billing. The show would not go on as the Jesse McReynolds Show. It would remain for the rest of his life, Jim and Jesse. This decision launched the final, most poignant chapter of their story, the last brother singing alone. For the next 10 years, from 2003 until his health began to fail around 2012, audiences at the Grand Ole Opry and at bluegrass festivals around the country witnessed something remarkable. Jesse McReynolds would walk out on stage. He was older now, frailer, the lines on his face deeper. He would walk to the center microphone, and next to him there would be a space. Sometimes it was just an empty space, a ghostly void where Jim had always stood. On other nights, to make the tribute explicit, a guitar would be placed on a stand under its own spotlight in Jim's traditional spot. The band would kick off a song, perhaps it was Grave in the Valley, and Jesse would step up to the microphone alone. He would sing the lead vocal, the part that Jim had sung for 55 years. His high tenor, which had always soared above, was now tasked with carrying the melody, and he did it. He sang his brother's part. But then the chorus would come, the part where the third voice was supposed to appear. Jesse would sing his high harmony, just as he always had, but the lead vocal, the foundation, was gone. His tenor would float out into the auditorium, a beautiful, perfect note of harmony, reaching for a melody that wasn't there. It was, in a word, haunting. It was the sound of a man carrying on a legacy, fulfilling a promise. It was the sound of a void. It was loyalty made audible. Imagine the courage that took to stand night after night in the exact spot where your partner of half a century died, and to sing the songs that require his presence, to feel the ghost of that harmony in your ear, a muscle memory so deep that you know what should be there, and to be met only with silence. Sometimes, to fill the void, his son, Mike McReynolds, would join him in singing Jim's part, and the blood harmony would for a moment reappear, a beautiful fleeting echo. Or his grandson, Garrett, would play mandolin, showing that the musical dynasty would continue. But most often it was Jesse alone holding the banner for two. When journalists would ask him, delicately, how he could bear to do it, how he could sing those duets by himself, Jesse would often give a quiet, simple, and profoundly mystical answer. He would say, "Oh, I can still hear him. When I'm up there singing, I can hear Jim singing his part, just as plain as day. He's still right there with me." Whether he meant that in a purely spiritual sense or as a musician who had the part so deeply ingrained in his memory that he could hear it internally, it didn't matter. For Jesse on that stage, he was not alone. He was still in that 50-50 partnership. He was still singing with his brother. This final act, this decade of solo fidelity, forces us to re-evaluate their entire legacy. It frames their 55-year career, not as a story of hits and innovations, but as a story of love. What then is the lasting historical significance of Jim and Jesse? It is not a single simple thing. It is a threefold legacy, as perfectly balanced as their music. First is the legacy of innovation. This is Jesse's gift. With the invention of cross-picking, he gave the mandolin a new language. He was not a founding father like Bill Monroe. He was not a fiery rebel like Sonny Osborne. He was the gentleman innovator. He proved that you could fundamentally revolutionize your instrument without blowing up the tradition. He expanded the borders of bluegrass, not with dynamite, but with the meticulous, patient genius of an architect. Every modern mandolin player, from David Grisman to Chris Thile, lives in a world that Jesse McReynolds helped to build. Second is the legacy of professionalism. This was Jim's gift. In a genre full of tragic, self-destructive geniuses, the story of Jim and Jesse is a radical one. It is a story about not imploding. It is the story of the 50-50 handshake. It is about showing up on time, sober, and in a clean suit for 55 years. They are the patron saints of musical reliability. They prove that stability is its own form of genius. They prove that the most dramatic story isn't always the one that ends in a train wreck. Sometimes it's the one that simply, gracefully endures. Finally, there is the legacy of the bridge. This was their shared gift. Because of their grandfather's 1915 recordings, they were not just a first-generation bluegrass act. They were a living, three-generation timeline of American music. They were the connection from the pre-commercial, old-time string bands of the mountains to the big bang of Bill Monroe's bluegrass, to the rock and roll translations of Chuck Berry, and finally, to the modern global ambassador era of the Opry. They are in themselves a complete, unbroken history of the genre. Jesse McReynolds continued to perform, a beloved patriarch, well into his 80s. He carried the name Jim and Jesse until his own body, his own hands, began to fail him. He had fulfilled his promise. He had kept the music alive. He had kept the Opry spot. He had kept his brother's name in the light. He passed away peacefully on June 23, 2023, at the age of 93. The news was met with a deep, respectful sadness. It was the end of an era. It was the final quiet note of a song that had been playing for nearly a century. The tragedy of the Louvain brothers was that of fire and brimstone, a bond that shattered from its own internal violence. The tragedy of the Everly brothers was that of ice, a perfect bond that froze and cracked, leading to decades of bitter silence. The tragedy of Jim and Jesse is that of a void. It is the story of a perfect, unbreakable bond that was never broken by ego or greed or anger. It was a bond that held with perfect, gentle strength for 55 years until it was severed by the one unavoidable force of nature that no handshake deal can defy. Their career was a 55-year testament to the sublime beauty of a perfect harmony. And Jesse's final lonely decade was a testament to the courage, the love, and the profound loyalty of being the last brother left on stage, still singing for two, still hearing the voice that the rest of us could only faintly remember. Now finally the harmony is restored. The third voice is silent on earth, but one likes to think that somewhere in the only place that matters, the act is together again. The gentlemen of bluegrass reunited. The handshake deal and the 50-50 partnership fulfilled at last.